Dans ma leçon inaugurale, il y a quelques années, j'avais mentionné les révolutions de la linguistique qui ont eu lieu dans la deuxième moitié du XXe siècle. J'avais parlé de trois révolutions, dont deux étaient largement le fait des philosophes, et en l'occurrence pour la révolution de la sémantique, qui était la deuxième de ces révolutions dont je parlais, elle était le fait de logiciens, au premier rang desquels on trouve Richard Montague, qui était le principal, la personne à l'initiative, disons, principale personne à l'initiative de cette révolution. Et Richard Montague, c'était le directeur de thèse de Kamp, qui est aussi un des grands acteurs de la révolution en question, la révolution de la sémantique, c'est-à-dire l'émergence de la sémantique formelle qui, avec les outils, disons, de la logique mathématique, essaie de rendre compte du sens, du contenu des expressions linguistiques. Et Hans, sa contribution dans ce domaine a été majeure, puisque notamment il a apporté un nouveau cadre théorique qui se distinguait justement de l'approche antérieure, celle mise en place par Montague, par le fait au lieu d'assigner directement des valeurs sémantiques aux expressions linguistiques, l'idée était de procéder en deux étapes, d'associer les expressions linguistiques avec des représentations, un autre système de représentation qu'on pourrait appeler des représentations conceptuelles, et d'assigner des valeurs sémantiques à ces dernières, de sorte que le contenu des représentations en question puisse être hérité par les énoncés ou les expressions linguistiques qui leur sont associées. Et cette idée de procéder en deux étapes permettait notamment de rendre compte de phénomènes qui sinon restaient très difficiles à intégrer à l'analyse, des phénomènes ayant trait au temps, notamment des choses comme le passé simple, la différence avec l'imparfait, etc. Mais aussi l'anaphore pronominale et les phénomènes de ce genre. Donc ça a été un cadre extrêmement influent parce que ça permettait justement de traiter ces questions-là et de faire avancer la sémantique. Mais aussi, un des intérêts de cette approche, c'était le fait que l'approche introduise un niveau de représentation intermédiaire que j'ai appelé représentation conceptuelle, parce que c'est une façon de voir ces représentations, de les voir comme un peu un modèle de ce qui se passe quand les humains interprètent, comprennent les énoncés, comprennent du langage. Ce qu'ils font, c'est qu'ils associent à ce qu'ils entendent, enfin aux énoncés, au discours, ils associent des représentations mentales, et ce sont des représentations mentales qui elles-mêmes ont un contenu, et de ce contenu, les expressions linguistiques qui leur sont associées héritent. Donc il y avait la promesse d'un modèle des processus cognitifs d'interprétation qui a toujours été à l'arrière-plan, je crois, des travaux de Hans Kamp, même si c'était seulement à l'arrière-plan. Et dans la dernière phase de ces travaux, ça vient vraiment au premier plan, parce que la dernière phase de ces travaux, qui est la version de la théorie de DRT sur laquelle il travaille maintenant, la version centrée sur les états mentaux, vise précisément à rendre compte des représentations mentales en utilisant les outils mis en place précédemment. Et donc, je suis vraiment très content qu'il ait bien voulu venir nous présenter de façon systématique cette nouvelle phase de son travail, cette théorie MSDRT, comme il l'appelle. Il y a un quart de siècle, nous l'invitions pour les conférences Jean Nicot et nous lui attribuions le prix Jean Nicot, qui était très mérité. Et je suis vraiment content que nous ayons cette possibilité de l'inviter à nouveau ici, au Collège de France. Et dans le cadre de cette invitation, et comme il est de tradition, je lui remets la médaille du Collège de France. Je crois me souvenir qu'à l'époque du prix Jean Nicot, il y avait une médaille aussi, à l'époque.
Oui,
ouais.
Donc, toujours.
C'est la deuxième médaille. Là, je te laisse ouvrir toi-même cette chose.
Merci.
Bah oui,
puis-je l'ouvrir? Merci.
Oui, c'est difficile à ouvrir,
mais
pas ici, vraiment, mais
ah oui,
ça doit s'ouvrir.
C'est scellé, hein? C'est symbolique ou bien?
Non, ça devrait s'ouvrir. Laissez-moi indiquer aussi.
Ah bon.
Voilà.
Ah voilà, c'est François Ier ou bien oui, qui c'est? Bussy?
C'est sûrement François Ier.
Ah, Bud, ah bon.
Ah non, c'est dit, ah oui, Bud, qui donne son nom à cette
oui.
Et qui était le conseiller de François Ier qui lui a dit qu'il pourrait créer le Collège de France. J'en profite pour signaler deux choses avant de lui donner la parole. Une première chose, c'est que ceux qui souhaitent le rencontrer pour discuter, notamment de ses conférences et de sujets en rapport avec ses travaux, peuvent le faire. On a prévu un créneau le vendredi matin, 10h30 à midi et demi. Donc vous pouvez le contacter pour cela, ou éventuellement contacter mon assistant Greg ici, mais enfin vous pouvez le contacter directement Hans si vous voulez le rencontrer. Donc ça, c'est une première chose. Et une deuxième chose, c'est que sur le site du collège, sur la page où il y a le détail des conférences, du programme, etc., vous trouverez aussi un texte très substantiel d'accompagnement qui est une introduction à MSDRT. Donc je pense que ça peut être utile aux auditeurs d'avoir sous la main quelque chose qui correspond sans doute en partie, mais de façon plus détaillée à ce qu'il va nous montrer sur l'écran. Hans, je te donne la parole.
Merci. Et merci beaucoup pour cette introduction. Ces conférences seront en anglais. C'est la seule langue dans laquelle je peux m'exprimer plus ou moins comme je le veux sur des questions scientifiques et en particulier sur ce qui m'occupe. Mais d'abord, je veux dire quelques mots en français. C'est une langue que j'ai toujours admirée et pendant une certaine période, de ma vie, je l'ai parlé beaucoup mieux que maintenant. Mais une invitation d'une de ces plus augustes institutions des arts et des sciences, comme le Collège de France, était que je pense que je dois dire quelques mots dans cette langue. Et d'abord, je voudrais remercier le Collège pour cette invitation. Je pense bien que la procédure implique plusieurs personnes du Collège, même peut-être un grand nombre, et j'aimerais remercier tous ceux. Mais j'aimerais remercier en particulier celui auquel je dois cette invitation plus directement, François Recanati, et je voudrais aussi le remercier, pas seulement pour cette invitation, mais bien au-delà pour les travaux qui l'ont fait fameux, qui l'ont fait une autorité internationale sur le sujet de la référence, en particulier en langue, en langage et en esprit, et surtout ses travaux sur les mental files. Ça ne sonne pas très français, mais ce n'est pas de ma faute. Une notion qui va commencer, je me souviens très bien, dans les années 60-70. John Perry était un proposant important. Et cette conception a toujours été très importante, mais les contributions de François ont été, pour moi, une très grande inspiration, et beaucoup de ce que je vais dire dans ces conférences a été inspiré par les travaux de lui que je connais. Tous ceux qui sont au fait de ces contributions reconnaîtront ça, sans doute. Après ces quelques mots français, je tourne à l'anglais. And so this is where today's lecture begins. I chose the title, Referential Dependence in Language and Thought, as a general title for these 4 lectures. The original title for the first lecture is an outline of MSDIT and DIT architecture and motivations. This lecture actually is concerned with issues that are essential background to what I'm going to talk about in the next 3 lectures, for the most part. What I'm going to talk about today, as far as that topic is concerned, is not new material, but it is essential to get it across so as to have the right kind of background to these other things. Now, I don't want you to get misdirected during this first lecture by material that might actually give you quite the wrong impression of where things are going. So I've changed matters around a little bit, and I will start with some of the stuff that will be directly what we will be talking about later on. And I will start with the notion of referential dependence, with the notions of referential dependence that will play a central part in that. The effect of that, unfortunately, is that what I want to get across and what would have fitted within the time today, originally corresponding to this title for the first lecture, will have to be broken into 2 parts. So the last part of that you'll get next week, and then we'll continue with the central parts of this series of lectures. Okay, sorry. So referential dependence is a notion that many people have used in different senses. And in these lectures, there will be 3 related notions, related senses of this notion of referential dependence that will be relevant. 2 of them have to do with referential dependence of thoughts. It's about constituents of the mind. And the 3rd will have to do with language. And the first, so you see here, the general question is how the content of our thoughts can depend on how our mind is connected with objects that other thoughts are about. And what that amounts to can be 2 different things. The first is 1A, and that's the more familiar notion. That's the notion of having a thought about an object, and the thought is about the object by virtue of a particular connection that the agent, the person who has the thought, stands into the world. There's a connection between the agent and a particular individual or entity in the world, and that actually determines that the thought is about that entity. The second notion, 1B, is a different one. This is a notion that's entirely mind internal, and it's the situation or the case of a thought that is about a particular entity that's introduced by another thought. There's not necessarily any connection with the world that's involved here. It's just something about the internal complex structure of the mental state of the agent. And then in addition, there is the notion of a referential or a denoting expression, a noun phrase like a proper name or a pronoun or a definite description that's being used by a given agent, and this particular use of the expression then gets its reference on the strength of a particular relation in which the agent stands for something in the world. So that's very much like 1A, except that here now it's about expressions used then rather than the actual thought in the mind of the agent that the agent tried to express by using these expressions. So that's these three notions of referential dependence. It's very abstract as I've put it here, but let's just look at an example to give this more flesh. And here you see actually the first example of a description of part of the state of mind of a certain agent in this formalism that I'm going to develop, this formalism called MSDRT that François Recanati has already mentioned, where MSDIT stands for Mental State Discourse Representation Theory. It's a rather dreadful name, but it says more or less what it is. But remember the abbreviation MSDIT, which I will be using. This structure in one is a description that this formalism makes available for the scenarios described above. It's a very simple case of somebody walking along the street on the sidewalk, and she thinks that she sees something in the middle of the road. Looks like a gold coin to her, so she forms the belief that that is what she's seeing, and forms a desire to sort of make it her own, and an intention to realize that desire by actually doing what she has to do, namely go to the middle of the road and pick it up. So this is very much simplified as a description, but it is useful as a first introduction to what's going to be really important in what's coming. So this is a description, the whole thing, of the mental state of this agent A, and it consists of just the three things that I mentioned, the attitudes that were provoked by her visual experience. So there is the belief of there being this thing represented by the symbol X with the properties of being a gold coin and of lying in front of the agent. The little I is for indicating the self by somebody who has a certain thought. It makes a thought about the agent herself. We'll come to that, back to that later on. So the components then of this description, these three propositional attitudes, the belief and the desire and the intention, they are all structures consisting of something that tells you what kind of attitude it is, a belief or a desire or an intention in this case, and then a specification of the content. And these content specifications are representations that belong to the underlying theory, DRT, for discourse representation theory. That is something that has now been around for 40 years, and I suppose quite a few have heard about it and maybe even know quite a bit about it. The format of those representations is always, you can see it best here, something that consists of two parts, the so-called universe. The universe is the entities represented in the content of the attitude. And here there's just one, that is this X, that represents the object that the agent A is perceiving, or at least thinks she is perceiving. And the important point is that that X recurs also in the representations of the content of the belief and the intention, of the desire and the intention. And that makes these contents of the desire here and the intention here referentially dependent on this object that is sort of introduced into the mind via this belief. So this is a case of type 1b, where the content of one thought is about something that's introduced in another thought. The content of the desire and the content of the intention depend in that sense on the content of the belief. And exactly what that amounts to in detail is actually quite difficult to spell out, and a certain amount of time will have to be spent in the following lectures to do that. So this is one description that MSDAT can provide for what goes on in the head of this agent. Here we have another description where now it's assumed that the agent forms, on the strength of her observation, an entity representation. It's this first thing here. That consists of three components that I'll say more about in a few minutes. And the other components that we saw a moment ago are basically like what they were before. The only difference is that now the belief here is the belief representation doesn't have this element X anymore. That is now part of the entity representation. So the X represents whatever the entity representation represents in these other content descriptions of these propositional attitudes here, here, and here. So what we have here is that these three propositional attitudes depend referentially on the entity representation. And the entity representation in its turn depends, and that's now a case of referential dependence in the sense of 1a. That depends for its reference on a causal relation, in this case a perceptual relation, that the agent stands in to the world, and that there is such a correlate or correspondence or relation between the agent and the world that is, in this case, responsible, in fact, for the formation of this entity representation. That is accounted for in the third component of this entity representation. This third component is what's called an anchor set, and it's an anchor set, and its elements are anchors, and these anchors are kind of witnesses on the part of the agent. They're part of the mental representation, it's all mental here, but they are witnesses of there being such causal relations between the agent and the world. And so this particular this one anchor in this set has only one anchor, and that anchor that says that I is seeing as object X, that is to be understood as A saying to herself, or having as part of a representation, I'm seeing this object, and that is what you see here. My entity of representation is a representation of that object by virtue of this anchoring relation that's witnessed by this little description over here. So entity representations are going to be extremely important in everything we're going to do, pretty much. They are the counterparts in MSDAT to the notion of mental file. As I already said in the few attempts to speak French at the beginning, entity representations and files are very much the same thing. It's just a difference of terminology. I'm using the expression entity representation because there are important differences with what other people, including François, have said about mental files, but basically the two kinds of things are the same, in that they stand for things rather than for propositional contents, which is the case for these descriptions of the contents of the propositional attitudes. The middle component, by the way, of the entity representation is to allow for the possibility of including in this representation of the entity certain properties that the entity is taken to have by the agent, and so that's sort of constitutive on this mental act of introducing the entity of representations. It is the representation of an X that, in particular, at this point, is lying in front of the agent, somewhere in the middle of the road. So these are two different descriptions of the same scenario, or the same mental state of the agent in that scenario. And much of what I'll be saying later on actually has to do with this kind of competition between these two different ways of representing, on the one hand, certain complex mental states, and on the other hand, as we will see, the semantic representations of certain utterances, attitude, attributions that in many cases are quite complex and involve several different propositional attitudes. So keep in mind, you have seen two different representations for the same situation, each with its own kind of referential dependence or dependencies, and we have to still figure out exactly what we could mean by those. So, let me just here notice one thing. We use, let me go back actually, the term sorry. Okay, I hope there's nothing. These descriptions, the two you have seen so far, are called MSD for mental state descriptions. So mental state descriptions will be a very central part of what's going to come. I think I've said basically all that's on these slides. I've left them in. I'll put the slides also on the web page, and so some of these slides, although I've already given the content, I've left them in here so that it's easier if you want to have a look at those later on to reconstruct what I've been saying. So this is once more the general definition of an entity representation consisting of this bit that says this is an entity representation together with this discourse referent, which in this particular case, the discourse reference that occur as second element in this first component of these entity representations are called their distinguished discourse reference. That's the terminology. And then, as you've seen, the second component is for a descriptive structure, it gives descriptive information for the entity represented, and this last script K is for this set of anchors. Now, so far I've only talked about the use of MSDIT in describing parts of mental states of agents, but in fact the original motivation for developing this theory had to do with getting an adequate way of dealing with the semantics of attitude reports. I mentioned this already a moment ago, especially entity reports which involve several different kinds of propositional attitudes, such as a belief and a desire, and maybe an intention, and maybe still other kinds of mental propositional attitude modes. And this is actually that's been missing in the semantic literature for a long time, in my view. The attention has always been on very simple sentences, especially in the philosophical tradition, like John believes that Mary is in Paris, or John hopes that Mary will come home, and things like that. But it's the combination of beliefs and desires and intentions that very often interest us in other people, and that we often attribute to them because that's part of how we think that they click, why they have done certain things that they did, by a combination of what they believe to be the case and what they hope to achieve. So here's just one example that we're not going to treat in detail, by the way, but where you now have a referential dependency of type 2, where it's expressions that are involved. So you can imagine that A, after having coming home from this walk, then says to somebody else, what's there in 3? On my walk yesterday afternoon, I saw what looked like a gold coin lying in the middle of the road, and I wanted to take it home, but I had to give up my intention to go and pick it up because there was so much traffic. So in the end, I just walked on. So the point here, I've tried to make it sound a little natural, but the point basically are these 3 noun phrases above us here, this definite description, what looked like a gold coin, and then these 2 occurrences, the pronoun it, they all refer in this utterance made by to the entity for which she has this entity representation according to the previous MSD I showed. So the general idea here is that very often a noun phrase in the mouth of an agent refers to a particular thing by virtue of it, the expression, having been used in the utterance to refer to the referent of an entity representation the agent A has, and that via its distinguished discourse referent will also then occur in some of the propositional attitudes of the agent. So, like the belief that we had and the desire he expressed by want, and then finally the intention. So that gives you an idea of these 3 different kinds of referential dependency that I've talked about. And I want to say a little bit more about the use of certain denoting expressions, noun phrases, and in particular here about proper names that typically, on the view adopted in MSDIT, are used legitimately only when the speaker, the utterer, has an entity representation labeled by the proper name she is using, and where her use of the name on this occasion comes with the intention, has to be understood as referring to what it is that entity representation stands for. So here's an extremely simple example. The sentence, Mary is in Paris, uttered by some, well, maybe same agent A, or a speaker S in general. And the standard use of a proper name, as it says here, by N, by a speaker S, is a legitimate use of it only, and now I repeat what I already said, S bases that use of N on an N-labeled entity representation for the entity that you want to refer to with N. This is something that's worked out for the first time in a paper that on proper names that appeared in Kenntnis in 2015. So here is, again, a very sketchy or schematic representation, MSD, for the situation that we assume S to be in if she makes legitimate use of these 2 names, Mary and Paris, in her utterance. Her mind must contain at least these 2 entity representations for Mary and for Paris, and these are N-labeled in the sense that in the descriptive part of the entity representation, there is something that says the entity I am represented is named Mary. So that's part of the descriptive content of these entity representations in these cases, likewise here for Paris. So if what S says involves a proper use of these names and also is sincere in the sense that it corresponds to what she thinks herself, for that to be the case, the mental state of A must contain these two entity representations, I already said, and then also a belief to the effect that the entities represented here, here and here, stands in this spatial relation of Mary being in Paris. So this is still all from the perspective of the agent and speaker. The agent who produces a certain utterance must be in a certain mental state for that utterance to be a proper utterance, and in addition, for it to be a sincere one. But we can actually now also turn to the recipient of the utterance, somebody who hears what has to say, an individual H. And here's the second part of this claim about the proper use of proper names. The interpreter of a sentence with proper names, like Mary is in Paris, also should have entity representations, labeled entity representations, for the names that the speaker uses, Mary and Paris in this case, and interpret these names as part of his interpretation of the utterance as a whole by making use of those entity representations. That is, in the ideal case, the recipient H will have a Mary-named entity representation for the Mary in question, and an entity representation, a Paris-labeled entity representation for the Paris in question. Well, let's assume there is only one, but of course that's not quite true. And then he is meant to use those entity representations in interpreting the utterance by, as you can see here, forming a representation of the content that makes use of the distinguished discourse reference of his entities from Mary and Paris. And if he moreover accepts what is said as true, then he will make this into the content representation of a belief. So that's what's represented here. The result of H's interpretation is a new belief that corresponds to the content of the utterance as he has understood it. So he now has anchored that belief to his representations for these entities, Mary and Paris. And you see here the beginning of something that we'll say much more about in the third lecture in particular. We see the beginning of what you might call a communication theoretic way of doing semantics. You have the speaker who is in a certain state of mind. Part of that she tries to puts into words. These words are decoded or interpreted by the recipient, and the recipient forms a content that is a successful case of interpretation of the utterance as the speaker intends it, so long as the content representation that the recipient constructs through interpretation matches in the right way, that means at least has the same truth conditions as the thought that the speaker used her utterance to express. So you can actually think of utterances and the words used in them, and with all the syntactic structure that comes with it in a proper language, as kind of intermediaries between the thoughts of the speaker on the one hand and the recipient, the interpreter, on the other hand. We'll say more about this way of thinking about how you can understand and develop a detailed theory of meaning of utterances and meaning of sentences uttered on the basis of this kind of successful communication. That is, of course, a very highly user-oriented way of doing semantics, but there's also a somewhat different way in which we can think or see what I just described about what the speaker is doing and the hearer is doing as pointing towards a different, more abstract way of approaching the problem of natural language semantics. And that says the following, or is based on the following idea. So long as the interpreter actually uses the rules of the language that's being used by us and him correctly, so it's part of the grammar on this view of a language that it gives you rules as interpreter for constructing representations like that. And if the interpreter does that right, then in the typical cases, what he produces will be the same independently of it, whether it's him or some other agent. So there's a kind of a canonical representation that a properly operating recipient will arrive at. And that sort of now abstract representation, detached from the particular interpreter, can be thought of as the logical form of the sentence or utterance that is being interpreted. And so a logical form approach to natural language semantics is one that sort of abstracts away from what goes on in the minds of particular interpreters and just says, well, if the rules that are available to interpreters are correctly applied to particular utterances, then that assigns them the logical forms. These are these structures of which we have seen a number of examples. And the true semantics, say for a fragment of natural language, English or French or whatever, whose utterances get logical forms by such an interpretation procedure, a logical form semantics will say, okay, here I've got my natural language sentence or an utterance thereof. Here I have the logical form that gets constructed by any proper interpreter. If I can find an independent characterization of the meaning of those representations, these things in boxes and examples, then I thereby can also get myself a semantics for the natural language fragment that gets assigned such representations as logical forms by fiat or by stipulation. The semantics for the uttered sentence is going to be the logical form. So what is required for that to actually work in detail is an architecture. This is the architecture of DIT, and it's inherited by MSDIT, an architecture that consists of the following components. We have this fragment, natural language fragment L. Yeah. That's the fragment we want to study. And then we need an algorithm, it's called the construction algorithm in DIT, for translating at least sentences and other well-formed expressions from this fragment into these logical forms I've been talking about. These logical forms are, you might say, sentences or formulas of these logical forms are formulas or well-formed expressions of a formal language, the logical form language. Where do I have it here? Better look here. And this logical form language, this representation language, that has to then, in such an approach to the semantics of our fragment L, to be defined independently with its own syntax and its own semantics in the sense of formal semantics, starting with Montague, something that at the very least gives you values for these logical forms in models. So I'm going to say more about model theoretic semantics later on, but so the logical form language has this central role, a sort of intermediate between the natural language fragment on the one hand and models that represent the ways in which the world could be that the sentences of this language L can talk about. And so that is the general architecture of logical form approaches to natural language semantics. It's a bit different from the way in which Montague set things up, where you relate expressions from the natural language fragment L directly to elements of the model. But it's, in spirit, quite similar, but it gives you a lot more flexibility to have this intermediate level of representation via these formulas of the logical form language. So the logical form language has to be defined independently, but of course in the right way, and it's linked on the one hand to the models and on the other hand to the well-formed expressions of L for which it provides the logical forms. So DRT is, as I said, an approach towards natural language semantics of this logical form kind, but it's also, and François already touched upon that, within this larger family, one with special properties. Oops, sorry. What's missing here? And these have to do with the fact that DRT is really a theory about not just meanings of sentences and perhaps constituents of sentences, but also of discourses and sequences of sentences that form a coherent story. And the motivation for DRT, this goes back now to the late 70s, in fact, was twofold. At the very beginning, that was the point of departure, were observations that have to do with the role that tenses in discourse not only locate the events or states that are described in the sentences that are marked by them, but actually connect those events and states also to events and states from the antecedent discourse. And that's really an essential feature of how these tenses work in different languages. That is one of the tasks that the semantic theory should be able to address. And so the really important question then is how to go about with that. And the second type of phenomena, but that came a little later, are things having to do with cross-sentential anaphoric connections, like a pronoun in one sentence referring to an antecedent in an earlier sentence. Here are some examples from the DRT literature, just to illustrate the kind of phenomena that DRT took to be its task to explain. Now I'll go through these very quickly. We don't have that much time left. The first two examples, this one and the next one, are about the role of, in particular, the two past tenses, passé simple and imparfait. In French, the point is the contrast between this passé simple form sourit here and the imparfait sourire over here. And I hope this comes across to you, if you haven't seen this before, that the difference between these two examples here and here is that if you read the first one, Alain ouvrit les yeux et vit sa femme qui était assise près de son lit. Elle lui sourit. That suggests that the smiling comes, so to speak, after his opening his eyes and seeing her as a reaction on her part. If you use instead the imparfait here, souriait, then the effect is more like she was smiling when he opened his eye. That's the first thing he saw. And you get a similar effect in English with the simple past of this event verb smile here and the past progressive, past progressive there. As a very similar sort of example, and one that I will say a little bit more about when the last part of today's lecture, is, three versions of the same thing. First is very much what we just saw. Joseph turned around, the man pulled a gun from his belt. That suggests very strongly that the pulling of the gun follows the turning around, maybe as a reaction to it. Joseph turned around, the man was pulling a gun from his belt. Again, that suggests that when Joseph turns around, that's what he sees the man in the process of doing. And then here we also have, in addition, a past perfect. Joseph turned around, the man had pulled a gun from his belt. That has already happened, so this event is before that one. He was pointing it at Joseph. In all these cases, the task is to give a systematic account of how the rules for tense interpretation of these different tense forms work so that you get these semantic effects. Here are next two sets of examples are from the nominal domain. This is I thought I should say something about donkey sentences. There's this wonderful affiche that was made here, and it had a donkey on it, and the poor donkey is cut in different panels. Each lecture, a bit more of the donkey becomes recognizable, I think, the idea. So this is a classical example that people have been thinking about within formal semantics in particular for a very long time. These sentences where you have, so A and B are both single sentences, and you have an indefinite somewhere occurring it, and pronoun it somewhere else, and the pronoun is understood as somehow anaphoric to the indefinite. But in order to really understand how that works and how that is compatible with getting the right semantics for these sentences, was a puzzle that was actually already recognized, although perhaps people didn't quite understand what they're doing. I don't know. In the Middle Ages, indeed, discovered this puzzle, and then people have been working on it ever since he published this in his Reference and Generality. Then the third example is basically another version of the same sort of puzzle, but here we've got two sentences. The first one is indefinite, and the second one has the pronoun. The pronoun clearly refers back to the indefinite. And it's actually quite clear that, in a very important sense, the relation between the pronoun, the indefinite, antecedent is the same. And a proper understanding that was one of the claims that DRT, when it addressed this problem, made, was that we really have to have an understanding of what happens in these donkey discourses if you want to get a proper account based on that in important ways for these donkey sentences, B and C. Okay, so last 5 minutes. By the way, in the future, I'll try to make some room for discussion, but I think today isn't all that much time, so I've decided not to, but we can discuss whether we want to have discussions during the lecture. There's always a possibility, as François was saying, of, if you really want to know more about this, coming to the Friday meetings. One last example that's also important is a very old example that was first thought of by Barbara Paty, apparently already in the early 70s, where you have another puzzle about pronouns. If you compare A and B, so the first sentence in A and the first sentence in B are really express the same proposition. So if you think that it's just the propositional content that allows the pronoun to be interpreted, then you would expect that if it's possible to get the proper interpretation for the pronoun it here in A, it should also be possible in B, but that's not so. The antecedents of pronouns must sort of be introduced as entities in the discourse, very much in the way in which discourse reference tried to capture them. And it's also clear that this is a phenomenon really about pronouns as opposed to other expressions that can be interpreted anaphorically. In C, we have replaced it by the missing marble, this definite description, but that is perfectly all right, not only here, but also there. Okay, so these are some of the facts that DIT has made it its task to explain. And part of the story that it wants to tells is how you actually construct the logical forms that it offers, these discourse representation structures, or DRSs, of which this is one, from a proper syntactic analysis of the natural language, sentences or discourses, that the theory assigns these logical forms to. So let's look again very briefly at the first of these three Joseph discourses, the one with the two simple past event sentences of English, here turned around and here pulled a gun from his belt. And let's assume that we've already constructed a representation for the first sentence, Joseph turned around. And let's assume it looks like this. So here the universe of the DRS has a discourse reference for the time of the earlier event from the point of view of this utterance. It's a time t before the utterance time n, and the event described by the sentence, and then a discourse reference for the subject term Joseph. And the descriptive content is that, well, the time of the event was before n. It was the location, the temporal location time of the event, in the sense that the event is, the duration of the event is included in that time. And then, okay, we have to represent somehow that it's about Joseph. Now, we have already seen a more complicated, the beginning is a much more complicated story about proper names. So this is just a simplification. I don't want to spend more time on it because time is more or less up. And here, this then says that E is an event of Joseph turning around. So what we then will do, and since time is up, I will already have to end more or less at this moment, is to construct stepwise. It's the one illustration of this sort of process I'll give in these lectures, but I think you'll have to see it. I have seen it once. This is a syntactic structure for the second sentence of the man pulling a gun from his belt. And we built the logical form or semantic representation from and for this syntactic analysis of the sentence bottom up. That is, we have a lexicon which gives us the semantic representations of the different words occurring in this syntactic structure. So for the verb, pull from as a three-place relation, and strictly speaking, four-place if you include this, the event that's being described. And then this is for the pronoun his of his belt, and this is from the noun belt, and this for the noun gun. And that's then sort of you work your way up from the bottom, and this is the representation that you get for the verb phrase, that is this bit over here. And then that still has to be combined first with the direct object, the gun, and then the indirect object of the from object belt. So this is the representation you get that way for the verb phrase. And then the verb phrase has to be combined. This is the verb phrase, this is over there, with the information of tense that's sitting over there, this tense level projection. And that then has to be combined with the subject phrase, the man, and eventually what we arrive at is a representation that looks like this. And I'm not going to describe it now. It just says that there was an event, E prime, of the pulling of a gun in the past. What is missing here, however, is the relation between this event of the pulling and the event of the turning around in the first sentence. So that is where the transcendental effect of tenses comes in. And so what we intuitively would want to have is an additional condition that says that in this case, the pulling comes in reaction to and after the turning around, which connects the representations for the first and the second sentence together, so to speak, and then you can put these two DRSs for the first one that we saw earlier and this one for the second sentence together, and we get a representation of the two sentences. This is all much too fast, and what I will do starting next week is just giving you the remainder of this story and explain in what sense that kind of forces DRT to be a representational theory and theory of the logical form type. And there is another issue that played a very important role here too, and that is a classical observation that in French, if you have a text with sort of a narrative text with passé simple sentences, then these are typically understood as contributing to the meaning of the text, something like events that are punctual, are points in some kind of time structure. And the really important question there is then, what is that time structure? That's the first thing next week. And then we'll return to the subject of MSDRT and start with the semantics of these complex attitude attributions that consist of beliefs and desires. And there's more attitude than just one. Thank you.